free of charge, with the goal of strengthening local organizations and community responses to the overdose epidemic. And we handle requests from organizations of different backgrounds, from hospitals to local nonprofits, from healthcare providers to peer advocates. And if you're interested in learning more or submitting your own requests to the ORN, you can go to our website at opioidresponsenetwork.org. I'll put the link in the chat once I'm done speaking. And submitting a request is a simple process. You just click our large submit request button in the upper right-hand corner of our website, and the request form takes about 5 to 10 minutes. And then within one business day, you'll hear back from the ORN technology transfer specialist from your state to learn more about your request and the goals you want to achieve. And again, all training and technical assistance is provided through the funding from SAMHSA, so it's free of charge. And if you have if you want more information or have questions regarding a request you're interested in, my contact information is in the chat. I'll put it in again at the end of the training. And then finally, access to CE credits associated with today's training will be provided in Carrie's follow-up email sent out next week. So that will also include the slides and any materials related for today's discussion. And with that, I will hand it over to our amazing presenters for the last training session in this wonderful series. Thanks.
So good afternoon, everyone. Really great to see you again, those of you who are returning and those of you who are here for the first time. I'm here, Jonathan Edwards, and I'm here with my collaborator, Chacku Mathai. And here are our speaker profile introductions that you can read in your leisure time. I think the most important aspect in our bios here is that we're very much entrenched in this work, and we're committed to bringing information that can really help to engage the communities that we serve in a more competent way, in a sensitive way, and also today's focus on intersectionality and peer support. So if we could move on to the housekeeping, we can get rolling. And so we always like to remind people of the Zoom features to electronically raise your hand if there's something that you'd like to share, the mute and unmute button. Also, please utilize the chat. I believe that it's enabled so that all of the wonderful resources that end up landing in the chat can be saved. And if not, I know that Carrie will send them out afterwards in the materials that she'll follow up with. And, you know, we are in a virtual space, so we ask that you be as present as you feel will bring the desired results from this training. I always like to say your bathroom and your snacks are in a place that should be familiar to you because you're all in your respective spaces. And then also toward the end, we are going to have a survey, and it's not just a formality, it's information that we really depend on to get your feedback to see what we could do differently and what we've done well. And it's very important to the funder and project managers as well to see the feedback that you have to offer. So thank you. And I think we'll move now into the body of our presentation, and I'll turn it over to Chacku.
Thank you, Jonathan. And hi, everyone. I'm really grateful to be here. We'll start with a couple important acknowledgements. One is a land acknowledgement, and that we are each likely participating on the ceded or unceded land of an indigenous people. So for me, where I work, it's the Lenape homeland, or otherwise known as Manhattan. And where I live is upstate Rochester, New York. It is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, and by honoring the sovereignty of the Six Nations, the Mohawk, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, Seneca, and Tuscarora. So I ask you to join me in acknowledging all indigenous people and all ancestral and unceded lands of their people, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. Most of the institutions for which we work must also acknowledge that they were founded upon exclusions and erasures of many indigenous people. This acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to begin the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. We also have a labor acknowledgement. Now, we must acknowledge that much of what we know of this country today, including its culture, economic growth, and development throughout history and across time, has been made possible by the labor of enslaved Africans and their descendants who suffered the horror of transatlantic trafficking of their people, chattel slavery, and Jim Crow. We are indebted to their labor and their sacrifice, and we must acknowledge the tremors of violence throughout the generations and the resulting impact that can be felt and witnessed today, and which is a major form of our work together today. So I'm excited about the training that we're going to do. And let me turn it over to Jonathan to kick us off.
Great. So I'm glad I'm not seeing the slides, because this is a time that we really want to invite you into the space organically, and to sort of find out what your expectations are from today's training, what you may know or have heard about intersectionality, particularly in peer support, and how you feel the tools today will help you to show up with a deeper, more engaged understanding of who you are, how you show up, and how your various aspects impact how you impact others. And so I would sort of like to invite you all to see what you could put in the chat in terms of what your expectations are or understandings are, and we will begin by acknowledging those and sort of incorporating them into today's discussion. So I thought I would just continue talking until I saw things popping up in the here we go. So we're still getting introductions. That's great. Hello, Mark. And yes, once again, yes.
Oh, we could invite have people unmute and
yes, you can also unmute and share,
raise your hand,
put in the chat or raise your hand. We encourage you to feel comfortable just jumping in, because we're not always able to see the hands. Hello, Bill. Buenos dias.
I guess I'll say something. I'm not exactly sure about the whole intersectionality thing, so that's why I'm here to learn. But from what I gather, I am recently new to obtaining my CPS certificate, my SERPA certificate, and my CARC certificate. And so a major reason why I come onto these platforms is to get more knowledge of how to deal with the individuals that I come across on a daily basis. So for me, the intersectionality would be not only where I come from that aspect, but the other part of who I'm dealing with and what relationship I have with those people, whether it be the individuals I serve, the organizations that I work with, the partnerships that I create. I find some type of intersection of how I can relate to those people. So I'm not sure if that's exactly what this platform is for, but I know it's about learning and trying to find out what works for other people and how I can implement that in my daily living.
Thank you so much. Other people want to jump in?
Hey, Jonathan.
Hello. Hi, Bill.
Yeah, I just wanted to finish my thought. No, we ran out of time last time, so I didn't have a chance to finish my thought. What I just like to, I think it goes with what your question was, the intersection, and that is the boundaries. And so it's important for all of us to understand. I mean, I'm SERPA. I'm sure there are almost everybody here is a peer. So I think we get our importance. It's making it known to the other people that we work with. That's the big challenge. The other thing is that despite all the good stuff that we have our lane. And I strongly believe, and again, this is just me, I strongly believe in the team effort, where the SERPA, the CASAC, the social worker, the nurse, the doctor, we all work together to give the person who's coming in for services the best that they can get. And so, yeah, there was a couple of things I heard last time that I may have misunderstood. And I think it's important that we maintain our boundaries for our protection, so that, because I'm a supervisor as well, so that, we protect the workers. And, from God, since I came back to this country, I didn't realize how, what's the word? Everybody's quick to sue somebody, and everybody's quick to find out who's the last person, so I can pin the suit on them, so I do my best to protect the people that I work with, and make sure that, what our boundaries are, If we want to go beyond those boundaries, great, get more education, do what we need to do. But yeah, I'll end there. Thank you. Love this. Love these past 5 days, 6 days. What was it? It's been so long.
All right, thank you so much, Bill. And I hope that, we'll touch on some of the things that address, how we show up in various spaces with both privilege and marginalization, and how those aspects sort of exist simultaneously. I think that gets into what some of what I'm hearing you say about like protecting people and protecting ourselves. And, that's a fluid concept that, changes from setting to setting. And so we're really looking forward to digging into this conversation, and thank you for looping in your experience from past sessions with this. I see that Heather is writing, I am here to learn and further my awareness. If you are not sharing, would you kindly mute? Thank you. I'm here to learn and further my awareness of services being provided or that could be provided to those underserved populations we work with. Okay, and that's going to be part of the conversation as well, but more of an emphasis of not just the services, but how those services are offered and provided, and sort of the lens through which we're all engaging with other people. And that lens is typically coming from our own experiences. So we're going to talk about how that happens as well. And then someone asked about what is intersectionality, and we're prepared to answer that. But what we'd like to do is sort of move into that as we want to do some demonstrations before we actually give a literal, commonly understood definition. So not to give away the party bag so early in the game, if that's okay, if we can agree on that. All right, so you're saying perfect, thank you. Okay. Do we want to hear from anyone else before we move on in terms of expectations, what you're looking to learn from today, how you're looking to use it in your work? Give it another couple of seconds and then we'll put our slides back up. Okay, thank you, Chacku. So we're really looking to define intersectionality as both a concept, and that's how I took the question that was asked in the chat, and with respect to our own identity. And in doing so, Chacku and I are going to share some of our experiences in a particular exercise that we've done to really not just get a cerebral definition of this concept, but to also, share with you all what it looks like to experience intersectionality through an introspective and self-assessing process. That involves really having a sense of our positionality and privilege. I mean, one example could be that we're all on a training platform now getting really great information that, for each one of us, there may be hundreds of people who don't have this opportunity to attend the training in the middle of their workday. And at the same time, we're here in this space, but many of us may understand what it's like to be marginalized or on the margins of particular populations, whether it's the color of our skin, our sexuality, our height, our weight, our social class, and so forth. And so we're really looking to demonstrate how we experience both positionality and privilege simultaneously, and how that informs how we show up in various spaces. And then how do I leverage my positionality and privilege in my work as a peer supporter? So just sort of taking the example of opportunity further, is that we have the opportunity to be here on a training platform and to get some really good information made possible by funding and by these wonderful organizers, Carrie and Katie. And what we can do is not just be here and take in the experience, but we bring it back into our workplace, and hopefully it enriches the engagement that we have with people we interact with. Hopefully it makes us a little bit more sensitive to our own issues, to our own pitfalls, to our own strengths, and how we can more organically be with people because we have a better understanding of who we are. I know in my own experience is that the more I learn about myself and the more that I become willing to sit with the discomfort, I think the more potential there is for me to be a better asset in someone else's process if they invite me to be part of that process or invite me to guide them in that process. And it's not just me sharing words, but also re-experiencing my history and being able to, present that to a person, sometimes to help them not feel so alone. And so those are some of the ways that I might use my positionality to help someone else to feel unstuck, because I also went through that process. And then 4, we're looking for ways to identify ways to reflect on our personal biases and how they might show up in our work. Chacku and I, we talk about this a lot, and as recently as a couple of hours ago, just talking about how I see myself, Jonathan Edwards, as a Black gay male who is highly educated in the formal sense, and how I leverage that privilege to sometimes overcompensate for the areas in which I feel marginalized, but also to hopefully help others to feel empowered who are experiencing marginalization. Also, as a Black gay male who experiences marginalization in some aspects, that doesn't exempt me from having personal biases and implicit bias. And, I have a story that I may share later. I don't remember if I shared it here before. I don't think I did. But I'm capable of that as well. And with the implicit bias, that might show up in my actions, and it might actually cause harm to someone if my actions are based on false beliefs that I allow myself to cultivate. So these are some of the things that we really want to get into today. And we're really looking forward to talking with you all and hoping that our experience encourages you to do a deeper dive into self. So we can go to the next slide. And I think, Chacku, this is you.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan.
Yes.
So there's a few things that we want to offer, and one of them is some frameworks for you that are practical and that can be used, and that we also, of course, model throughout the training, and also want you to consider as a way of being even during this time together for the next, until the end of this training. So one of the frameworks that I found to be very helpful to me, and I was introduced to it a long time back, maybe 2004 now, and I've used it ever since, and I've just found it so helpful to me. And this is a framework from Glenn Singleton about courageous conversations about race and racism. And it was used in conjunction with one of the exercises that Jonathan referred to on intersectionality that we'll talk about. But the first kind of 4 principles here that I wanted to emphasize are these agreements. One is that to stay engaged. And what that means is, there are ways in which we disengage from uncomfortable or difficult conversations. We feel some emotions and we kind of turn intellectual or something, or maybe I check out and leave the room by turning off my camera or something, things like that. Or maybe I'm no longer in the conversation and I can't even hear it anymore because I'm kind of having a conversation of my own, for example. So there's a lot of ways in which that disengaging can occur, and what are the ways I bring myself back into those situations so that I can do this other agreement, which is to speak my truth, and to be able to be open about what I'm experiencing, what my vulnerability is, that my authenticity is about. So there's an importance there. It's not necessarily about my opinion. It's about my truth and the perspective of what am I going through in that courageous conversation. So that includes experiencing discomfort. Jonathan, you mentioned it right at the earlier, is that one of the things that you pay attention to is that, can you experience discomfort and learn from it and stay with it, and know that conversations that have to do with marginalization. So when we're talking about being peer supporters that work with marginalized communities that we are either part of or can relate to, or maybe are not, there may be uncomfortable conversations or uncomfortable experiences that we need to pay attention to. And so what happens to us when we are uncomfortable? I think that's an important thing to consider. What are the defenses that show up when we're uncomfortable? What buttons get pushed for us, for example? I think one of the things you mentioned, Jonathan, in the objectives, and we talked about if when bias, for example, is a defense mechanism that often comes up in the midst of discomfort, and it gets utilized at times, as belief systems to kind of cope. They don't have to be that way, and they're often not working for us, but we keep using them, So we can find better ways to cope with the discomfort. And one of them is to accept and expect non-closure, that the conversations aren't necessarily going to be one and done. When I start an uncomfortable conversation or initiate conversations, whether it's about race or about any other aspect of identity, these are personal. So of course, they're going to need ongoing dialogue. And that's one of the important areas that we are focused on, which is that we're not only starting conversations about our intersectionality, for example, we're engaging them, we're sustaining them, we're doing it in a way that keeps people at the table, and we're deepening them. So we're deepening them to a point where we're able to join each other in the analysis. One of the things that I've always appreciated about compliments I receive afterwards, I see it as good feedback when someone says, "Chacku, that was really uncomfortable. Can you come back and do that again?" That's kind of the idea, right? Is there some capacity to move into that place together of dissonance and deepening? And for me, there's just no better place. It's a wonderful place. That's why I'm willing to go back there over and over and over again. All right, so I start with, I'm sorry, were you going to say something, Jonathan?
I was talking while muted.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So I was wondering if I could just give a quick practice example of this, since we're talking about utilizing these concepts in peer support. I was talking with Chacku earlier about, getting back to the intersectionality piece of being privileged in the area of having a managerial title, having a degree, having a license, and being a supervisor of almost 30 peer specialists. I'm going back 10 years ago, and I had a supervisee who was a very gifted male who happened to be white. He had a lot of knowledge. He had, I believe he had a desire to really support and help people. One of the things that became clear to me was that I believe that he had some racist tendencies, and being a supervisor and someone that I believe he trusted, there were certain things, he was letting certain cats out the bag, and in one sense I felt really privileged that he would trust me, but in another sense I felt marginalized because I'm still a Black man and I'm experiencing those microaggressions and those micro invalidations that he's expressing about the people on the inpatient unit where he's working. And so supervision became even more layered. And it wasn't so much about, are you writing notes and are you doing this and are you running your groups? But it's sort of like, are you willing to take a look at some of the things that you're showing up with in the work, and so that was sort of staying engaged despite my discomforts around how I show up in his analysis of what he thinks of people, and then sustaining that relationship, even though there were times when I just wanted to boot him out of my office and say, go get another job. But that's not going to help him through the process. It's not going to help me. It's going to be one of those disconnects that Chacku talked about. And then deepening the understanding by being willing to have the conversation without expecting instant results. And I think that goes back to expecting and accepting the non-closure. I believe that this person 10, 12 years later is still doing the work. And I admit that when he reaches out for yet another job recommendation, that it brings up a lot of stuff for me. And sometimes I avoid him, and other times I have a conversation with him and I check in with him about where he might be with certain issues. And it really is uncomfortable because I'm also a bit of a fixer, which as peer supporters, we're not fixers. But, I think that's just something that I bring from my own background. And, so I want everything to be okay. And I don't want him to be a racist anymore. And I don't want him to do harm to people. And it's really hard to be in the middle in that gray area with these kinds of issues. But, it's the work. And I, as peer specialist, you're going to experience a lot of this or a lot more of this. And, you know, when someone comes with their views, it's not about you. It's not denouncing your worth, but sometimes we can feel invalidated by what people bring into the room with us. And in a position of power and privilege, we're oftentimes trusted to hear things that also hurt us. So just to kind of demonstrate some of the complexity of this, and I guess keeping our eyes on the prize is having the opportunity to continue to do the work and to really have a parallel process where we go into ourselves over and over again, and we model that for other people in service to others. And I think we can go on now. Thank you.
It's a great story, Jonathan. It's fine. I think this is the kind of thing we want to have a deeper conversation about. And that is the kind of example, those circumstances, the conditions in which we are saying we're working now. You know, we're not avoiding important conversations that affect whether it's the peer support relationship, the care that someone receives, the support that someone gets, including the people that are, you know, working with us. And from, you know, someone mentioned earlier, I think it was Bill, the interdisciplinary team. There are a lot of opportunities for conversations that need to be engaged, sustained, and deepened, especially around differences in perspective, and to really allow those multiple worldviews from different practice models, for example, and approaches to come together and not only build common ground, but also appreciate the differences and actually recognize them as valuable. And so that leads to my point. You know, I was introduced to that concept of appreciating my difference and the opportunity in my difference by a woman named Pamina Yellowbird. Pamina is a leader from South Dakota, an indigenous woman that was doing keynotes a lot of times. And when I first met her, it was during this, we had these conferences. This was a NIAPRS conference in particular in the early 90s. And I was frustrated at this conference because I felt like I didn't belong there. I didn't feel like my narrative was really a fit. I felt like everyone was kind of, there was some master narrative that didn't really address the differences that I found. So I was outside smoking a cigarette, pacing in the, you know, outside, and ranting to myself a little bit. And Pamina came out, and she was also going to just hang for a minute, but she saw me and she said, "Hey, are you okay?" She didn't know me, but she was just offering the moment. And I said no, and I just kind of went off a little bit and talking about how I felt like I didn't belong there, and how when I walk into a room, people stop talking because I clearly don't belong there, and you know, things like that, right? And so, and I was a younger person. You know, there's a lot of different reasons why I felt marginalized. So she actually said that. She said, "Sounds like you're feeling marginalized here by the differences you have." I said, "Yeah, exactly." And then so she said, "Look, I got to go do my keynote. I hope you don't mind me saying this quickly, and I hope you come back in to hear my keynote. But I just wanted to offer you this one thought, that did it occur to you that maybe your difference in those moments are actually your power? That there's some privilege in that moment, that everyone stops talking because you don't belong there. What is your opportunity to do something with that moment, with that silence that everyone suddenly stopped talking? Now you have a chance to show up. And there's other people who don't get to do that here at this because they're not here. So how can we leverage that privilege, that power in this moment?" So I really, as she walked away, went to do her keynote, and I was like, well, who the heck is she telling me my marginalization, my oppression is my power, you know, that kind of thing. And then the next second, I'm thinking, well, that was Pamina Yellowbird, whose people have been erased. And she's about to talk about the asylums that were created for the Canton Indians. So yeah, I think she gets to say something to me about that, you know, maybe I have something to learn. Now, that's not the only reason why I was willing to learn it, but I also recognized that, wow, was I uncomfortable with that truth? You know, and she spoke it, you know, and she shared it, and she maintained a relationship with me after that to mentor me through those changes. So I'm grateful to Pamina. I've talked about that ever since. This is my story of discovering the power of my difference, and the reason why I want to make sure that those are seen as much as my commonalities. In that sense, I want to also offer, you know, some understanding of what we mean by power and privilege. So for me, and what we're talking about here when we talk about power is that ability to decide who will have access to resources, capacity to direct or influence the behavior of others, oneself, or the course of events. Privilege is a similar kind of power, but it's when it's unearned, when it's not necessarily by the capacity of something I created, but just, for example, by being a cisgendered man, right? I have a great deal of unearned access to resources and input and perspective and respect as a result of that. So it's just kind of that kind of dynamic that we're asking each other to self-assess in this process. So yeah, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. So there's a comment from Mark. Mark, thank you. And Carlos, I hope that you are having less trouble now with your audio. I just want to acknowledge that. Mark, hello. Thank you. You said, though I have never considered myself as marginalized, I do experience discomfort and find that quite a number of clients mention also the systemic bias towards people with mental health issues. And I really wanted to seize the moment just to sort of reflect on another example of intersectionality. Now, I'm not going to guess who you are and what your dimensions are, but I would venture to say that if you've not really ever seen yourself as marginalized, it probably is because for the most part, you haven't been. But it's interesting that you move into that place where you begin to engage the concept of there's a little discomfort around the fact that, people with mental health issues have. And this is a really good example of demonstrating how we can be both with privilege and marginalization at the same time. And even if 9 out of 10 areas of your life, let's just say if 10 is the denominator and 9 of those areas, you feel favored and you feel, part of and, sort of at the core of acceptability, there could be one piece, and oftentimes it's invisibilized or eclipsed, perhaps, a mental health challenge has not been at the forefront of one's life, but then in dealing with people that we're serving, we find, why am I here as a peer supporter? It's not just because I'm white or because I come from a good family or because I'm educated, but maybe it's because I have something in common. And in being in a role of a peer specialist, there's privilege there also. And that's one of the problems I have with the terminology of peer, because when we're working with people who are in the system, in one sense, we may be their peer philosophically, but in a practical sense, we have a lot more privileges than they do at the time. So I'm also careful about that, but I just wanted to point out that this might be an example of intersectionality, just experiencing a great deal of privilege where we're not able to see where we're marginalized until it's reflected through someone else that we're working with. So I may be way off, and even if this doesn't pertain to you, I would venture to say it probably pertains to someone.
Do you mind
No,
if I
you're
chime
not
in
way
here?
off.
Hi, my name is
Mark, were you going to respond to that?
I just with the people I work with, I work both with residents of supportive housing, which is primarily substance use related, as well as one floor of our building is a homeless shelter. So I work with both areas, and I find, more often than not, I'm working with people who have mental health difficulties, and they are very resistant to getting services, admitting, opening up about their mental health issues because they think it looks bad. And getting people to get past that can be very difficult. Some of them are dead set, but some of them realize that that's not a good way to think, but they still see it, and they see the bias against people with mental health illnesses and issues. So anyways, that's all I have. And that is how I feel. You know, I have, as I said, I never felt marginalized, but I have always felt the same resistance due to my mental health diagnoses. There have been times that I have become very angry. I don't want people to know about it. I've not sought out treatment because of it. You know, that type of stuff. Fortunately, this day and age, I work pretty well with all of it. So I've learned a lot over the years. So thank you.
Yeah, Mark, thank you so much. And I know we'll move on and hopefully be able to circle back. And I certainly on a personal level, I would be so interested in learning more about your experience, because it sounds like you've had a transformation. It sounds like that you've had a shift. And I think that's the danger sometimes with labels and terms, is that they can be very limiting. But what you just described without labeling really sounds like the acceptance of strengths and sometimes disadvantages, even if it's our own reluctance to be in touch with something of ourselves that can produce shame. So thank you.
Jonathan, we also have a hand up by Stephen. You want to just...
Yes, Stephen, please. Thank you, Chacku.
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to piggyback off of what Mark was saying and just share that I have also experienced similar situations just with my own neurodiversity. And I remember, I think years ago, just having been diagnosed with certain things my whole life that it never even, like, even since childhood, I had never even thought about them as like disabilities in a lot of contexts, because for a lot of times I had the supports I needed. It just felt like a thing I had, like, oh, I don't consider acne a disability. It's just there. Just unfortunate, but but then it wasn't until like later in life, into adulthood and my career, where I would experience situations that I would find traumatically unsupportive, that made me go, oh God, not only is this absolutely a disability, there's even additional ones I hadn't even uncovered yet. And it really reaffirmed that notion that a lot of like neurodivergences are more social conditions as much as they are mental conditions, and that like when someone's accommodated, it doesn't prove to be a disability at all. So that's also something that made me have to address my own internalized ableism and like accepting, oh, I do have disabilities, because feeling disabled wasn't something that really resonated with me until I actually felt disabled by it.
Thank you, Stephen. And one of the things we're also going to see in our later definitions and discussion is that, you know, something around which I may not feel marginalization today, that could change over time. And that's, you know, that's part of this constellation of concepts that that make up this definition, is that, you know, as you said, at one point in your life, you didn't see it as such, and later on in life you did. And that could have been because of how other areas of your life were showing up and converging on that issue that was not problematized or problematic at a certain point. So, you know, you're illustrating some of the things that we're coming here today to really foster dialogue around. So thank you for being willing to share your experience. Are there any other hands? You know, it's hard with the slides up. Sometimes we miss people.
I think we're good. Yeah.
Okay,
We're gonna
great.
move on, though. I think we're
Yeah,
good.
sure.
All right. Thanks, Jonathan. So there's an exercise that Jonathan and I are gonna kind of talk about our experience with, but what we'll be doing, because I can't share, I don't think I can share it in the chat. What I'll do is I'll share the exercise in a PDF form with Carrie, who can send it out with the presentation. I'm hoping that's okay, Carrie, from your perspective. So what we'll do, though, is just to give you a little bit of an orientation to it, is that this form, and this is from a colleague named Jody Clement, who created this to work with people. Specifically, she started with, you know, a combination of students who were social work students and a number of other categories, and helping them identify a number of different social identities that they might identify with across a number of different categories. And I know, you know, the categories that are listed, are not, comprehensive, but everything from, years of education to gender identity to marital status and parental status or age, physical appearance. There's a number of different places where one might identify. And they're overlaid with circles representing degrees of centrality or privilege, as well as proximity to the margins or otherwise marginalization. So the further out is oppression, the closer in is the greatest amount of power, which would be at the center. So just with that brief overview, I'm just going to show you an example of my own. What I did was I put a dot on each line for each of the categories where I fit on that 7-point Likert scale. Would I further out, like, so years of education, I'm a fairly uneducated person. I'm not, formally in terms of formal education. So I put myself out and towards the edge there. Or parents' household income, or, different things like, at the time of my age, I felt marginalized by when I did this particular one, by my political orientation, my chosen religious status, the languages I speak, things like that. Identifying, this is from a self-assessment perspective. Or from, for example, my gender identity, I put way in the center because I felt like as a man, I have a great deal of power there. And, things like that or my sexual orientation as a heteronormative kind of person, I felt like that was where I have a lot of acceptability, social acceptability from that perspective. So there's a lot of different aspects of who I am that came out of this. And then I shaded it in. I connected the dots, which was kind of fun. And then I shaded it in. Now I have a visual display of the varying levels of marginalization, oppression, power, and privilege in my experience cumulatively. And what that does for me is a few different things. But I'm going to hold that because I want to give Jonathan a chance to jump in about his experience with this, and then we'll reflect on. We'll do a little fishbowl dialogue with each other about that, and invite some conversation about it.
Thanks, Chacku. So Chacku actually shared this exercise with me 2 weeks ago, and I procrastinated, but we won't dig into what that might be about. I don't see a domain for that, but I'd probably be in the center with that one because I have a lot of experience with procrastination. But my favorite part of this activity or exercise was when I finished plotting all the dots and I just kind of bowed my head down and I was shading very slowly. It felt very therapeutic, but just to get down to business, it's informative and in ways more empowering than disempowering to me to see the whole. Because to even recognize ourselves as a whole is a great accomplishment. It's a great place to be at, and that whole includes places where we've experienced ostracism, marginalization, estrangement, as well as full acceptability, accomplishment, and pride. And so starting out with the education piece, and this is just such a big debate in our peer support community around formal education. And, some of us have to remember that, the educational system is another institution, and it's a place where people also experience a lot of oppression. I certainly did as a young person. But I will also say that in a way, I believe education saved my life, because when I was at a point in my recovery journey about 22 years ago, and I was without work, let's just say I was without, paid taxable income. And, I was just going through quite a bit, and I hadn't finished school. And I found that in my occupational circles that I was hitting a lot of walls because I didn't have the piece of paper. My response to that over the next 15, 20 years was to just go, wild with, earning degrees and digging into knowledge areas that I loved, and accepting that I wasn't going to be, a Rhodes Scholar, but that I could certainly leverage my accomplishments in a way that would give me voice to talk about some of the areas that I don't feel so empowered in. So to me, it's almost like adjusting sliders. You've seen those, like you take a survey, you adjust one up and the other one goes down. And as we said, that this is also fluid. So I might do this a year from now, and due to any number of circumstances might feel differently. So where Chacku talked about, the heteronormative acceptability of being, heterosexual, for myself as a gay man, I don't think of myself as a 1 or a 2 in terms of self-worth, but in terms of how I might conceptualize myself within society, I'm putting myself closer to the edge, because I also understand that, that's not really seen as the norm. This is also reflective of my own internalized homophobia. So that's the whole thing about doing a self-assessment, is it's not just based on what we think others think about us, but it's also what we think about us. And so that's another interesting layer to this exercise. When I look at parenting, for example, what another privilege. Boy, do I hate when I'm at Amtrak and getting online and they start, pulling the people with children and strollers, and we're going to put them on first, and in a way that, that's an accommodation. It's a form of privilege. And so I don't have that privilege as a parent, but it doesn't mean that I don't have good paternal instincts and that I could not be a good caregiver or guardian. But just in terms of how society sees me in that role of parenting, I'm like a 1 or a 2. I'll do 1 or 2 more for the sake of time. When I look at my parents' education, I believe that they might be 1 notch further away from, the privilege area, but both my parents, who started out monetarily with almost nothing, were able to build themselves, economically, and to both get, bachelor's and master's degrees and raise a family. And for that, I'm really, really proud of them. In that sense, if we got to an area like maybe a STEAM or something like that, I rated them higher than I rated myself, for various reasons. Age. So I'm going to be 60 in August. I know I don't look it, but it's a number. And so I put myself in the 3rd, because even though some days I feel like I'm 40 or 30, whatever that means to all of you, I also realize that as an older gay Black male in the workforce, is that, not only am I pushing against the things that I've dealt with most of my life, but now I've got this societal ageism and also self-ageism. And some days that's a lot to deal with. And I'll take 1 more where I feel particularly empowered, maybe occupation. So I don't think I'm in my dream job. I mean, what we're doing in these moments, which is not my regular everyday activity, this is more of a dream job to me than the job that I hold, for which I will have a pension and health benefits and all that. But it's not my dream job, and I understand it. But by not working in my dream job right now, it gives me the opportunity to do things like this. And even at approaching 60, I'm thinking about still going after my dream job, because I can. And that might sound cocky, it might sound arrogant, but it's all part of this constellation of attributes, whether I'm closer to the margins or closer to the center of privilege. So I hope that that sort of demonstrates a little bit the complexity, the enlightenment, the introspection, and what's revealed through this activity. I feel very excited by it, because I think having the opportunity to kind of, say, hey, well, I'm not feeling so great here, but I'm feeling a little bit better here, and how I can better talk about disadvantages or perceived disadvantages with people who may also be feeling the same way because of other areas where I've been able to experience privilege.
That was very well said, Jonathan. Thank you for taking the time to go through some of your experience with this. And in the interest of time, I think what I'd like to do is move forward with, examining some of those dynamics. So for example, one of the things that comes up right away for me and for anyone who's kind of done this and the way you described this, John, is that there's stories behind every single one of those selections, right? And one of those identities and locations. So we're thinking about the complexity of our lives and the understanding of these intersections. Knowing ourselves is one important step in that process. So in order to work with others who are also having their own experiences of multiple, cumulative, complex, intersecting identities, we're going to need to have a pretty good sense of where we're at, in order to be able to hold up the mirror with anyone else. So the idea here is that those reactions. So for example, I can't wait to hear what Jonathan's dream job is. Like it made me want to lean in and go, oh, tell me more about that. Like I can't wait to support whatever that dream job is. And you know what I mean? Like there's all kinds of opportunities in conversation about this and relational work around this. But more importantly, I think the thing that I wanted to get out of this the most, and by using it in trainings ever since I was introduced to it, it became just part of my fundamental training work, was because it gave everyone a chance to really see where we can leverage our power and privilege and connect around our marginalization, you know? So the empathy that I have with Jonathan is not just based on a singular identification. We connect at a higher level because of what we've shared with each other through this process. I know that the liberation that Jonathan seeks is different than potentially the liberation that I seek, yet it's very much shared. It's bound up together, you know? And I take that quote, by the way, from a person named Lilla Watson, an Aboriginal leader. You know, but the idea here is that there's that opportunity for a greater understanding of each other. So let me kind of move to this idea of what we mean by that with intersectionality. In terms of definition, this was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. And when she coined this, she was a law student. And the story basically is that she was examining a case in which a Black woman was suing for discrimination against an employer, but the judge ruled against her because the employer had hired Black people and had hired women. But they were not willing, and the judge was specifically not willing to describe the discrimination that she experienced as a cumulative around being a Black woman. But because the employer had Black people, but also had women, but the employer did not have Black women. So there were no Black women in the organization, but they wouldn't file the suit based on that or accept the suit based on that. So that's when she realized there needs to be a name for this. And we need to do something about it. And so intersectionality was coined at that point. So this describes how race, class, gender, and other aspects of our identity intersect and overlap and interact with each other. It informs how we can simultaneously experience. And this is what I was like, wow, that's true. I can both experience oppression and privilege at the same time. Simultaneously, and I couldn't quite get my head around that for a while because I was experiencing it, but I wasn't quite sure how to make sense of it, you know, and this helped with that. And of course, it promotes the idea that our identities don't, you know, operate in silos, that we experience these things. So for example, I can experience the great privilege of being at a conference and at a peer conference, even have more sense of power because my identity is actually valued there. Right, as opposed to maybe at another conference where I'm that's some stuffy conference of other people of some other professional discipline that maybe I don't get as much attention at or something, you know. So these kinds of things are interesting to me. Jonathan, let me turn it over to you to kind of handle the next pieces of this.
Yeah, and just want to level with you all that I'm the stuffy conference attendee. No,
that's why you go and I don't. That's it. There you
go. Actually, we go to a lot of different conferences. I'm having some construction. It's not my construction, but it's in my background, so I apologize. I'll try to talk over it.
Oh, we can't hear it. It sounds good. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. So intersectionality, I just want to read this first and then sort of, you know, talk to you and link it to some of the examples we've heard and shared. And so intersectionality is the complex cumulative way in which the effects of multiple forms of discrimination, such as racism, sexism, and classism, combine, overlap, or intersect, especially in the experiences of marginalized individuals or groups. So just the example that Chacku talked about is the organization hired women and Blacks, but not Black women, and not examining the combined and cumulative effect of what it is like to be a Black woman just versus the singularity of being Black or a woman. And, we can see how different areas of our lives become wrapped up and engaged in this whole of who we are, and how our experiences are usually reduced to whatever, even if it's a range of marginalized identities, it's the one that's most visible. So when we talk about tenets of intersectionality, we know that human lives cannot be reduced to single categories. And there's a wonderful quote, I believe it's by Audre Lorde, and I can't quote it. I'm going to invert it. Chacku may know it, but it has to do with none of our issues are, there's no such thing as a single issue. Do you know the quote, Chacku? It's a really beautiful quote.
Not off the top of my head.
Okay, so yeah, so I'll try to find it and put it in the chat. But our lives cannot be reduced to single categories, and oftentimes, we're pushed to be in a box of singularity. And when analyzing social problems, the importance of any category or structure cannot be predetermined. That kind of leads us to that idea we talked about earlier about these concepts being fluid, like what might be seen as an asset today, tomorrow may not be. What I don't recognize today is something that I'm reckoning with later on in my life. And that's going to change based on our environment, based on our perception of things, based on information, and based on who we're in the room with. Third, relationships and power dynamics between social locations and processes are linked. They can also change over time and be different depending on geographic settings. And what comes up for me most of all is the idea, it makes me uncomfortable because I learned that I do it, and it's called code switching. Now, I might do it a little bit less now, or I might just be less conscious of when I'm doing it. But it was a journey to admit that, yeah, I code switch, and I'm not even going to say two, because I'm not going to take your inventory. But, I think about some of the areas and arenas that I've been in my life, and how even if I wasn't externalizing the code switching, I was internalizing it. It could have been a denial of my own true identities in favor of the dominant culture in which I was traversing at the time. And I used to feel a lot of shame and discomfort around it. And now it's really more like, if I can get some acceptance around it and understand its underpinnings, then I'm developing the power to dismantle it and to possibly witness other people in the same process of dismantling their complexity and internalized a whole bunch of things. So, this once again, this has gone from being a singular understanding of intersectionality for me, say several years ago, to now really understanding the different layers of it and the different dynamics of it. And I see it as energy and knowledge that sort of changes over time. So, yeah, we can move on.
Yeah, I I want to join the conversation here a little bit. There's a couple things that have been raised already by people who have shared, and Jessica, I see your hand, so I'm just going to finish this thought and then get to you. So Stephen and, for example, I think it was it Mark? I think, is that your name? I can't see your name there, but the conversation was really important because I think the recognition of whether it's the words we use to describe ourselves, the ways we've been labeled or that we choose to identify with ourselves, these all carry different meanings, right? And making sure that we're not necessarily making assumptions about other people's identities and about what meaning they make behind those identities and the reasons behind their choices around what identity is being willing to be pushed forward versus pulled back. This is an opportunity to have a lot of humility around people's experiences. So for example, Mark, you were talking about other people choosing not to disclose. That's an opportunity to go, why am I so comfortable disclosing? What are the ways in which I might have more comfort with this than someone else? What are the ways in which someone else may have had to survive in their communities or in their societies, and why certain identities may not be pushed forward as a result, So this became a way of organizing. For example, in community organizing, the leaders always became like whether it's the addiction recovery movement, the various overlapping mental health aspect movements, and other civil rights movements, the people who are willing to speak up or disclose their experiences oftentimes were people who had more privilege and power, and so they ended up being more leaning towards those groups in terms of representation, and it became harder to actually include people if with honoring the discomfort that they might have. All right, let me stop and get, who was it that had their hand up there? I don't know why the names don't show up for me.
Jessica.
Jessica, thank you, Jessica. When you're at this, sometimes the name doesn't show up on the screen. Go
No
ahead.
worries, Chacku. I was just first and foremost, I just want to say thank you guys because I completely had a misconception of what intersectionality was. I looked at it as a positive thing, which it is a positive thing in a sense. But I looked at it completely different. But the thing about it is, just like you just said, Chacku, it's cultural humility, self-disclosure, and I believe that's what's gonna break the silos. It's gonna break the stigma. Is when people get more comfortable with their intersectionality, where we wear many different hats, and it doesn't define us. It doesn't give us the identity, and our self-awareness is actually where we can use those to get the strengths from even where we come from. And that grid that you just had, that template, that's something I didn't even know existed. And now I want to utilize that in my organization so that everybody can actually get a little bit more accustomed to knowing how really intertwined we are. You know, we do have a lot of similarities, and then our differences are what make us.
All right. All
So
right.
thank you guys for that.
Yeah, great. I'm glad. Yeah, it's very practical. We really wanted this to be practical application for this work. Stephen, you wanted to say something?
Yes, I wanted to say that I think even within just the past couple of years, I've tried to like shift my language with how I talk about different how to say different communities, especially in terms of like mental health, to be more neutral. I remember seeing a form I was working on updating for a community a few years ago, and like one of like the areas it would be like, oh, like list like disability status. It would be like mental health problem, and then it was being switched to like, I think from mental health disorder to, or like mental health condition. And I remember reading those and I'm like, I hate all of these. Everything feels so like removed, even though technically I would be checking this box if I was following how this form is intended, which is why I started switching to terms like neurodiversity. As soon as I heard that, I was like, oh, great. Like I've had people who have known me be like, oh, like you could, like, I remember writing like a college like entry letter. I forget what the heck they're called at the moment, but I remember writing them and someone being like, oh, like you should talk about like your struggles with this. And I'm like, my struggles? When have I ever mentioned a struggle? Like it's just anything within different contexts. It felt like a strength or a weakness, and I didn't feel comfortable with pinning it to either because it didn't feel true to me. But calling it like diversity felt accurate in that it felt like it allowed for more fluidity and also let me own it more. Like, and I think that's might be something a lot of our clients experience when, if you ask them like, oh, do you have like a mental health issue or a mental health problem, they're probably gravitating towards the problem or the issue or the disorder part, and that's what has like the connotation that makes it hard to internalize without also like having some humility there.
Right.
And I think
And
just
you're realizing in that conversation that you might be kind of incorporating a bias around or a meaning that isn't necessarily
right.
yours, right? So
And there's a lot of
obviously,
internalized ableism with it.
yeah, well, there's that, but there's also a way to invite other people's perspective about how do you describe what you're going through, right? How do you describe why you're here, what's what this is about or what we're trying to do. So this is great. I'm loving, and I know there's a bunch of comments going on. So in the interest of time, I want to keep us moving. Here's a couple things that we want to engage. So first, Jonathan, it's okay if I tell the story now? You think we have enough time, and we'll start to reflect on that along with
Yeah. I can.
So this is Aesop's fable. I'll just tell it real quick, drop it down, see if there's any reflection that's helpful to you. But the reason we bring this up, is because there's a fox and the stork in Aesop's fable, and I have a adapted way in which I tell the story, so forgive me, but here's how it goes. So the fox and the stork meet each other. Fox and stork are like, how cool it would be to have a friend for a stork for a friend, or how cool it would be to have a fox for a friend. An appreciation for each other's diversity was really there, So the fox invites the stork over for dinner and lays out a plate and pours the milk, and the stork, because of her long beak, can't touch it, but the fox can lap it up. Now, the stork invites the fox over for dinner, and she's got this vase with fish at the belly of it. And because of her long beak, she's able to access it, but the fox can only stand and watch. So in this case, they both have an incredible desire for their diversity and their friendship. But what was exclusionary about their experience? The way they set the table, the very norms and habits that they had nothing to do with their desire or their belief systems about each other. It was actually just as simple as how they set the table. So the questions that come up are, what are the ways in which, because of my own identities, that I show up and set the table, you know? So one of the examples that comes up around, let's use racism as an example. And this is an unfortunate, we're not able to put a lot of content into our training today in the interest of time. But one of the things that I did want to make sure we talked about were some of those belief systems that are oftentimes, biases that we may not be as aware of. So one of the things that researchers at Harvard were trying to look into is what's behind these comments about reverse racism? And what are people experiencing there? And what they discovered through this research is that people were experiencing, white people in particular, were experiencing increasing concern about anti-white bias. In other words, that and I'll just show you this graph, as people perceived over the years from the 50s to the 2000s, that anti-Black racism was actually, or bias in particular, not necessarily structural racism, but at least the bias was starting to improve. They felt at the same time anti-white bias was getting worse. So it became a conversation, what they called a zero-sum game. So this idea of a zero-sum game is that if one group gets better, the other group loses. And this became an attitude that would get sold even politically to people, right? So I bring this up not to be able to unpack it all here today, but to kind of as an example of the kind of underlying attitudes that might drive policy, that might drive decision-making, that might drive the way in which we move in community, or even feel threatened by a particular situation or identity. Now, when we move into the fox and the stork example, I think, Stephen, you mentioned the word ableism earlier. I wanted to give a little bit of a working definition. This is Talila Lewis, and they've expressed from an expanded understanding of ableism beyond kind of a question of disability or just thinking about medical disability, for example, but really understanding that there's a systemic oppression that really comes from valuing people based on their culture, age, language, appearance, religion, birth, living place, health and wellness. These are all things that have various biases associated with them. There's assigned value to how we come across when you say neurodivergence, Stephen, for example, there's a meaning you're making there that's saying, yeah, I might be neurologically different than you, but there's nothing wrong with that from my perspective, and I'm not putting that on you. I'm just saying that's an example of what somebody might say. But the idea is that these constructed ideas of normality or productivity are embedded in our habits in terms of what we expect from each other. So, for example, one area that we didn't get to address here from an ableism perspective is that I didn't describe my video backgrounds in a training, or I didn't ensure that there was, ahead of time, work on the closed captioning or the language translation or the ways in which the other kinds of capacities might need to be engaged. Those are things we have to keep working on, in terms of our inclusion and our capacity. What are the ways in which we can do that as a community, and what are the ways we can do that in peer support? So in a similar way, Talila's definition of disability is recognizing the mismatch between a person's body and mind and the environment in which they're being expected to live in. So, for example, the very attitude towards people who have had to, access food, or resources. There's an orientation to that, whether it's looting or stealing or whatever it might be, in order to survive, without necessarily, and we have these policy conversations every day about what is illegal and how that should be addressed. And when a professor or a teacher didn't meet your needs as a student, or a program requires so in other words, when it becomes about how to show up and fit at a program versus how the service actually matches my needs, is kind of the very simple person-centered approach that we're thinking of. All right, Jonathan, let me turn it over to you.
I really like this last example because another hat that I wear is that I am on faculty in a graduate school of social work. And, last night was the final session of a course that I taught for the spring semester. And, in thinking about, one of the things that's happening in the academy is we are purporting to decolonize it. Now, what does that mean? It's more than a metaphor, as the article says. But one of the things that occurs to me is that, I was reared on this whole idea, and what we call it is sort of, colonialist white supremacy culture of the overemphasis on grade and achievement, individuality and outcomes and perfectionism versus, process, learning, authenticity, experience. And one of the things that I'm even examining in my own teaching is, the overemphasis on grades. And one of the best ways that I got in touch with that was to be reflective of my own academic process where, there were courses where I might have aced, but then sadly, I didn't really learn much. Whereas if I struggled with something and really brought myself to it more and didn't necessarily get the A, oh, here comes that noise again, then I'm coming away with more. So one of the things I just want to say is that I don't have this all figured out. I don't have the half of it figured out. But one of the things I ask myself is, how can I meet the needs of all students? And I'll even add to that without creating a double standard. And maybe at some point I'll even let that go because, what is a double standard anyway? It's we define it in a certain way, but not everyone learns the same way. And I know in, a lot of recent pedagogy instruction, they talk about designing your classroom, your course, so that it incorporates different learning methods to speak to the needs of various students, because not everyone is coming, with the same orientation, with the same background, certainly not from an equitable point of view where everyone is starting out in the same place. So I think for me, this example, it rings really true for me when I think about my role as an educator and how I'm really being mindful. And like I said, a lot of times I might miss it or I don't have it all figured out, but I'm asking myself, I believe, the right questions of how am I best meeting the needs of the students, and not as a cookie cutter approach, but how am I sort of individuating attention and feedback and working with students. And I guess I, think about the one student who didn't do too well in the class, and just how I spoke with her, and I mean, she passed the class, but I was really sensitive around a couple of different reasons of her not doing well in the class. So anyway, for the sake of time, I think we have to now talk about sort of what came out of this for you. What are your takeaways? We of course always have a little something to contribute, but we really want to hear from you in terms of what we presented as learning objectives, the concepts we talked about, the tools and technologies that we shared with you, and how those have operated in our own lives. Some of the wonderful, parables and stories that Chacku always masterfully shares, and the comments that you've all shared. And what are your takeaways? How are you feeling about incorporating any of these concepts into deeper self-reflection, and also the work that you do with people you support?
A lot of great questions, Jonathan. All right,
I'm looking for hands because I need to get better in that area of seeing.
No, it's all right. We don't have them yet. So how does, really thinking about this? Oh yeah, Jessica's got her hands up. Yep, go ahead, Jessica.
Yeah.
I think for me, it definitely strengthens my ability to be able to identify and relate with the people that I serve. Like I said before, it's given me the opportunity to be able to see where I can improve. especially with that template, being able to see what has held me back. And it may even be subconsciously, because I've never really done that deep dive into something like that. I've done many others, but nothing like that. And I think that may be able to open my eyes to where other people are coming from, so that I can identify better with other individuals as well. It does create like a common bond, like I said, with so many different walks of life. We work with organizations, we work with individuals, and even work on yourself. It opens my eyes to a lot of different things.
That's great, Jessica. Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the, how this affects peer support is the key question here, And for me, that moment where I realized, you know what, in peer support, we can't ever say, I know exactly what you've been through. I hope we never say that. Because I'll never know exactly what you've been through unless I start to ask you what you've been through. And I have to be able to have the understanding of my intersectionality and my identities in order to, and the impact of those identities in order to be able to lean into yours, right? So yeah, excellent.
All right, we have Reggie now.
Reggie, go Reggie.
Thank
Reggie,
you.
good to see you again.
Hi, I just want to again compliment you guys on these workshops. They are excellent. Chacku, I left my information there for you so we could talk about the entrepreneurial situation from
Wonderful.
last session.
Yeah.
One of the things that I do is we operate a 10-bed facility where we house returning citizens. And so some of the guys that come in, not a lot, but one or two, they I suspect that they're gay. And they, but they might be in the gang, or they might be, have this persona to throw you off. So my way, or our way of dealing with that is that when we have our weekly meetings, we just discuss, different lifestyles, and we discuss acceptance of everybody. And I bring up figures like a James Baldwin or somebody. It reminds me of that movie, the Academy Award winning movie, where the guy, he was this, gangster type, but that, he had an alternate lifestyle. So, we just talk about that, and we talk about the ignorance of people that don't understand that, we all have different DNA. We're all different. We all are attracted to different people. And, in an environment like this, it's not something that, we have to be very mindful and intentional about how we deal with that because of societal norms. So that's my input. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
Reggie, it's great to see you, and thank you so much for the work that you do and for the mindfulness and the willingness to, not look for work to be neat, but for it to be rich and complex and authentic. And I'm just really, really glad to hear you and see you and hear from you.
Thanks, Jonathan. I'm really proud of you. I've seen your development over the years. I've known you. You are taking over the world. I love it.
Heaven forbid. No. No. I'm just trying to take over me. I'm looking for other hands and or just jump in, unmute yourself. Chacku used the word before, liberation, how we all seek it differently. But if you're even on the cusp of saying, hey, I just want to unmute myself and say something, we welcome you to do it.
Melissa?
Hey, I love the series also. I've just been moving stuff around so I can calm Chacku and Jonathan. So thank you for offering these. And I know you started to get at these, but what I'd love to hear more about is if when we do that exercise, if we're a little closer to the center, if we identify that, how does that affect the way we're practicing peer support, knowing we all want to be very careful and respectful and not think that and have cultural humility. But that's what I want to learn more about, because
Yeah.
there's so much growth that I need there.
Jonathan, I know I have a thought on that, and I'll make room for yours too. I'm hoping.
Yeah, please go
Aaron,
ahead and save a
so
little for me.
what-
Yeah.
Great question, Melissa. Thank you for that. I'll just start with me, so I'm very aware, while I have a lot of experiences of being marginalized and oppressed, I can speak to those experiences, and I feel very credible in those experiences because they're my story. That's my story, right? That's who I am. At the same time, because of that, I'm also very aware of the privilege of, for example, of the things that I haven't experienced. So let me give you a very simple example, right? So while I've been in handcuffs and I've even been in lockup, I have not been to jail or in prison over a long period of time. So when someone calls me and says, Chacku, can you speak at this criminal justice forum? We'd love to have you speak and get, you're so articulate. I get a lot of that sometimes, which I don't know. I'm like, what that's about, but I'm not that articulate. I mean, so it's, like I know I turn to other people for that, but I think I say, no, thank you. I think the person you need is someone who's actually experienced reentry from prison for that conversation, because I recognize the seat at the table that I get to hold and that I can bring people to certain conversations that need to be there, so that's one example. In a similar way, that helps me also know and avoid this moment where I go, I know what he's talking about, or I know what they're experiencing. And then instead of saying I know to myself, I have a question that starts to formulate. And it helps deepen my relationship with people because I want to go, oh, tell me more about that. Can you say more about what it's like to immigrate to this country? When someone else tells me they've immigrated here from Bangladesh, for example, I immigrated here from Kuwait and India, but I did that in the 70s. That experience doesn't necessarily equate to somebody's experience today. So I'm wondering, instead of more curious, not necessarily feeling like it's less than or more than or worse than. There's no trauma competition here, but it's about really the curiosity and understanding that is built out of that. So Jonathan, how about you?
I'm really just eager to jump in, but I'm looking at it's 2:28, and I know we want people to take the survey.
Oh crap!
So,
yeah, thank you.
Yeah, this is a good thing. We'll hopefully
that.
leave them wanting more. And Melissa, we can talk offline since we have a collegial relationship and a friendship, so we can talk offline, and I'm sure you and Chacku talk as well. So yes, I think we want to see that survey because this is an instance where the data are really important and to inform what we do moving ahead.
Let me see it. I think it's on my slides here.
I can also pull it up if you.
There you go.
There it is. Thank you.
You're welcome. I apologize. Thank you, Jonathan, and thanks everyone.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.